There we go. Now we go. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another Beneath the Surface lecture with, not Mark Jackson, with Grant Abel, who's going to be talking to us tonight about the critically endangered Yangtze Finless porpoise. So this is another in our installment of lectures from experts in the fields of marine biology, or sorry, marine mammals, marine biology, or marine biology adjacent content. But we're going to be focusing on a really interesting topic, maybe an animal that most of you haven't necessarily heard of before, the Yangtze Finless porpoise. So this is a species that Grant has been involved with for a number of years. It's something that Grant and I have participated in some investigation of. We had the pleasure of being able to get a chance to witness and go see some Yangtze Finless porpoise in China in November of 2019 in a project that we had worked on as part of the Vaquita CPR project. So it's sort of an extension of that and looking at different critically endangered species of cetacean around the world. So I'm really looking forward to our talk tonight. Our talk, of course, is brought to us by Marathon. So we thank them for the opportunity to do this. And I'd like to introduce Grant right now. Grant Abel is the Director of Life Sciences at the Seattle Aquarium. Prior to that, he worked for National Marine Mammal Foundation during the Vaquita CPR effort. And then prior to that, for 12 years, also worked at Ocean Park, Hong Kong, as the General Curator and Director for Animal Care. He also spent 6 years at the Shimonoseki Marine Science Museum in Japan as the Curator for Marine Animals. He's currently also the Co-Chair of Conservation Planning for the IUCN SSC CSG Integrated Conservation for Planning for Cetaceans, or ICPC. It's a mouthful. And he's the convener for fundraising and working for the humpback dolphin, which is another critically endangered species that's out there in the world as well. He's the past steering committee lead for a symposium on the progress of the Yangtze Finless porpoise, also held in China. That's what we just talked about. And then the steering committee for another meeting, the Situ options for cetacean conservation, held in Nuremberg in 2018. He's a professional member of IMATA since 2003, and many other things included. So I'm really excited to have Grant speak to us today about this wonderful little porpoise that's out there in the world and some of the conservation implications of it. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Grant, and Grant, take it away.
Thanks, Dave. You did pretty well there with all of that. The Japanese though leaves a bit to be desired. It's Shimonoseki Marine. Isn't that what I said? Shimonoseki, yeah.
Shimonoseki. All right.
And it's there where I spent most of my time working with the marine finless porpoises from that region, the inland sea region, which we've been able to leverage a little bit for the Yangtze Finless porpoise. Now, I need to share my screen. While I do that, hi everybody, and I hope this goes well because I'm working off a number of screens here. Can you see that?
We can see it.
Okay, okay. We'll start. During this talk, I will speak to a little bit about Finless porpoise generally, but just to kick us off, Yangtze Finless porpoise is a pretty special subspecies of the family. It's been listed as critically endangered on the IUCN Red List since I think about 2013. The reasons for that listing, I think everybody could run them off in their sleep. It's all the usual suspects of, overfishing, habitat loss, pollution, you name it. They're impacted by it. But what's different is that the Chinese government and scientists in the country and internationally have been working for a number of decades now to prevent their extinction. Successive plans to conserve them have included bringing wild porpoises into what's called Oxbow reserves, or natural ex-situ reserves. And that's been a project which has been ongoing for at least about 3 decades. And that's the project I'll be speaking to this evening. What they've been able to do is establish an insurance population for the species within the reserves, and establishing that population has really been a major component of the government's conservation action plan for the species as a whole. Currently, there's around about 130 porpoises maintained in 4 designated reserves. Many of those animals have been born in those reserves. And they'll continue to expand the population and expand the number of reserves until such time as the work that's needed to be done in the main dam of the river and a couple of large lakes that are important habitats for these animals can be regenerated, because there's been a lot of damage to that environment. But even so, establishing this metapopulation, the ex-situ population, as they have, and they've been quite successful, it's still not a given that the species will survive. They've overcome a lot of hurdles, and there's quite a few more to really continue to work through. Before jumping into this, I do want to acknowledge, the work that I'll be speaking to here today is work scientists, NGOs, people in government in China and also internationally that have collaborated over decades to prevent this species going extinct. And in particular, I do want to acknowledge Professor Wang Ding and Dr. Yujing Hao at the Institute of Hydrobiology, the Chinese Academy of Sciences in Wuhan. They really have been at the center of this, coordinating much of the in situ and ex situ work that's rolled out over the years. And together with their colleagues, obviously, they've also been absolutely steadfast, and that's certainly my experience, in working to preserve the biodiversity that Finless porpoises represent in the Yangtze River. For these gentlemen, it's not just about the porpoises, it's about the entire habitat in which they live and the communities, human communities that are dependent on the river for livelihood, what have you. They really have, I think, set a whole new bar for cetacean conservation. I also want to acknowledge everybody in this photograph, actually, which includes Professor Wang and Dr. Hao. This was the photo. I think Phil actually might have showed this as well, Dave, during his talk. This was the photo taken during a meeting in 2019 at the Chinese Academy of Sciences during a symposium looking at the Chinese government's conservation action plan for Finless porpoises. And everyone here in some capacity or another have been working to support this effort. In particular, I do want to just call out Bob Taylor, Jay Barlow, Burton Wersick, who were part of the early efforts to help prevent the baiji from going extinct. Sam Turvey, who's also there, also continued to support this program. Frank Cipriano is somewhere in there as well. You can see Dave, I think, and Phil. And what's also important to notice is all the young faces along the bottom row. This conservation program is decades in the making, and it's going to continue for decades to come. And so what you're looking at is the next generation of scientists and folks that are going to be working on continuing to save the species extinction. I don't know how many people who are watching that are familiar with Finless porpoises, so I'll just quickly tell on that. these are photographs which I've taken in different places. I think it was around 2011 or 2010, there was evidence for establishing two main forms of finless porpoises, which led to a conclusion that there's at least two species, right? That's the Indo-Pacific finless porpoise, and there's a photograph of that one on the bottom left corner of this image, and the narrow ridge finless porpoise. And it's the narrow ridge finless porpoise that has two subspecies, the Yangtze Finless porpoise being the freshwater type, the East Asian finless porpoise being the marine type. Okay. What's interesting is that the East Asian marine type, there's the two photographs on the right-hand side representing marine finless porpoises, which don't look very similar at all. The bottom right-hand corner shows the Japanese form of the East Asian finless porpoise. And although they are finless, obviously, what's most interesting about the species, I think, from a more morphological perspective, are their dorsal ridges, and hence the narrow ridge form. The Japanese type has a very different dorsal ridge than the animals found in China and Korea. The Yangtze River subspecies, which is critically endangered, as you can see, has a ridge similar to its marine cousin in marine waters of China and Korea. That ridge emerges midway down its back, and they have very distinctive fat deposits lateral to the ridge, which you can see during the winter months in particular. But I think to really understand the conservation action plan finless porpoises, you really need to go back to the conservation planning for the Baiji, because it's really the Yangtze Finless Porpoise plan that is rolled out today was a plan originally established for Baiji. Whoa, I've just lost some light. But because porpoises live in a much narrower spatial range than their main cousins, it's really important to understand this. In 1980, the Baiji Research Center was established, and from about 1983, the team managed a young Baiji by the name of Chichi, which survived almost 23 years. That's the research center located near Wuhan. In about 1993, there was a population and habitat viability assessment for Baiji, which identified the list of threats that were causing the rapid decline in number. And they included, as I said before, the usual suspects of entanglement in fishing gear, ship strikes, illegal fishing, and so on. And at that time, what was also highlighted were concerns around water management projects. Of course, this was ahead of the Three Gorges Dam project. Finless porpoises were, of course, also subject to the very same impacts. And in 2006, there was a range-wide survey conducted looking for Baiji, during which no Baiji were seen. But at the same time, in 2006, they also did a population survey for the Finless porpoises. And it was realized that the population had decreased by about half since the mid to late 90s. It's the Finless population. And so in 2007, when Baiji was considered functionally extinct, and the realization that there was this entire mammalian family lost solely due to human activity, attention turned to Finless porpoises. And I want to speak to just the research center for a little bit first, because I think it's important to note that's kind of where things began. The research center has undergone a number of changes. There was a rebuild back in the early 90s, and it's continued to have ongoing renovations. there's been a small number of porpoises kept at the Centre for reproductive research and other forms of research. It's also enabled the team there to do is to understand the animal's responses to therapeutics, understand diet and nutritional needs when managing the species in managed care, understanding its behavior to some extent through training and animal husbandry, developing techniques for handling, safe techniques for handling. It's also acted as a focal education centre for finless porpoises. And most of the, in fact, I'd say probably all of the photographs that you see perhaps on the internet with finless porpoises underwater have been taken at this research centre. It's through that work that the social, community education and engagement work has really emanated. Obviously here too, there's other laboratories for all their genetics and cell preservation and that type of work as well. But none of that work, well, actually before I go to the reserves, we should mention that they have had some encouraging results. Some of the learning has come out of this research centre. They have had live births, a reasonable number. I think that's continuing to increase. But unfortunately, they've also experienced a low survivorship with those births. So there's quite a bit of learning to continue there. In 2014, we did have a workshop at the Institute to look at other successful programs, captive programs and reduction programs for finless porpoises in Japan, and look to leverage some of that knowledge for the Institute. We also looked at advancing animal husbandry techniques, advancing diet and nutrition studies, and also advancing veterinary technologies. Sharing those lessons learned has aided in some of the survivorship in recent years, which again is all focused around some quite intensive research and study on these porpoises. But all of that work over several decades and no less is really supplementary, complementary to the main conservation efforts in the field. Establishing the Oxbow reserves and establishing an ex-situ population has been a much bigger program with many hurdles to overcome. It took years, for example, to learn how to catch the animals safely. When we talk about catching an animal, to bring it into, whether it's the research center or into an Oxbow, or to simply translocate the animal from one place to another. In that environment, working with the species, it's incredibly difficult to do that successfully and safely for animals and for people. And it took a number of years. There were early losses, but the learning that was developed then is still being applied today. And today, when the team are catching animals for either health checks or sampling or translocation, losses are very rare because of this early work that was done. The catching method was described in 2004 at a conference in Beijing. These are images from that presentation. It's a combination of acoustic driving and corralling porpoises and a system of nets, until eventually being able to reduce the space that the animals have in the very last net that's used, which you can see on the top there. It's very, very fine net so that the animals cannot get themselves entangled in. And also identifying location in the river where it's safe for people to work in that environment has taken a lot of time to work out. I'd also add that you're looking at capture in one particular location across a strip of river hundreds of kilometers long, and also in the lakes. And so these technologies had to be transposed to other locations along the river and working with different teams of people. So it's a very, very complex, very time-consuming and challenging program to roll out. But they've been able to do that very successfully. And today they're able to catch animals in best locations, including the Oxbows, with relative safety. In addition to the catching methods, what they had to do was work out the transport method as well. Bearing in mind, back in the day, they were working with a species that nobody knew much about. They have worked with Finless porpoises in Japan from the mid-70s. They've been fairly successful there. But working with this species was new, and the animals were being caught in locations that were hundreds of kilometers away from the reserves and also from the research center. And so developing transport methods was another important step. In the images shown here are obviously transporting on cushioned foam mattresses with blankets and keeping the animals wet. Today, the transport methods have evolved so that they're able to transport the methods stretched in water and containers, so there's less weight on the animals. The animals are in a neutral buoyancy state while transport is occurring. So it's been a decades-long journey to really refine these techniques and to understand the best methods and when to apply them. In addition to that, what was also discovered was the animals were susceptible to skin disease, which was presenting post-capture, post-transport, presumably related to stress. And so the treatment of these animals and dealing with this disease, which they were seeing with animals that they caught as well, was indicating something going on in the water, and just another part of the learning process that they had to deal with. In recent times, these are images from the Poyang Lake taken in about 2011. In more recent times, in this environment, they're able to corral animals in these areas, these naturally formed areas, and then bring the animals into pens and hold the animals in pens slung between these two fishing boats. And in this situation, that they're able to keep animals in pens longer, particularly animals that they may be doing health examinations on for release back into the lake or back into the main stem, or animals that they may be planning to move into one of the Oxbow reserves. And what this method also allows is in future, when animals are coming back from the reserves, back into the lake and back into the rivers, having this initial step for the animals in a pen such as this, where you've got staff living in those boats 24/7, able to look after the animals, be there if needed, ensuring that the animals are eating before they're released back into the river with ideally with some wild animals. So again, the learning continues. It's gotten a lot more effective than in the early days when they were learning to catch, transport, and hold animals temporarily. I'll also point out that this is in the Poyang Lake. What you're looking at is the bottom of the lake. This is during the dry season, and one of the huge concerns at the moment around Poyang and the other lake is the water management. The level of the lake is something like 7 to 8 meters lower than what it would be during the wet season. And during the dry season, it gets very, very low. Of course, fish, prey, aggregate in different areas. There's intensive fishing there. And there's also sand mining, which is impacting the quality of the water and also the habitat significantly. So there's still some very big challenges to overcome in the natural environment. I'll just pull back a little bit and just to give people a sense of where this place is. The Yangtze River Basin is a massive area in China, as you can see from the photo on the inset. And the area where this work is taking place is below the Three Gorges Dam, just below Yichang there. The Three Gorges Dam obviously cut a significant amount of habitat or form a range of the porpoises. Nevertheless, it's still a very significant, very long stretch of river from the Three Gorges Dam all the way to sea at Shanghai. And you can see there the location of the Dongting Lake and the Poyang Lake, which are critical habitat for reproduction missing for this species. There has been some discussion about establishing population above the dam, and there may even be reports of animals up that way. It'll be interesting to see how those discussions advance and whether or not they're able to advance, because it's so an interesting option for supporting the species by putting animals up further upstream. But we'll see how that rolls out. This is an image of the lower part of the river, Yichang to the left there, where the Three Gorges Dam is, and it's showing the four ex-situ reserves. The very first reserve that was established, the Tien E Zhou reserve, established in 1992, is on the left there. That's the reserve where you hear about most often. It's a very large reserve. The second largest reserve is a word very difficult to pronounce. I don't think I'm even willing to try, but it's the Hunan and the Jichang Nature Reserve. It actually spans 2 districts of China, which is why it has 2 names, which is really interesting. And then you can see Wuhan and where the situation or the location for the research center. The other reserves further east to the right are smaller reserves with smaller number of animals. Nevertheless, they're important for all the same reasons, for obviously ex situ breeding and continuing to engage governments and people in the conservation of the species and restoration of the biodiversity of the river. Poyang Lake, which I've highlighted there, is a hugely important habitat, as I said, for this species. I noticed that there are moves to consider, well, there are discussions, not moves, but there are discussions on putting a dam across between Poyang Lake and the main stem of the river. There's been some studies into what that effect may be, and the effect is quite devastating. So it's hopeful that they don't actually do that. The surveys that are conducted to monitor the population of finless porpoises are all conducted in this part of the river. And just a note on that, it was around 1991, I think, or since 1991, I should say, when the population was estimated around 2,700 animals in that year, and got down to about 1,800 animals in 2006 in that last survey for the Baiji. In 2012, the population was estimated at over 1,000, and there was huge concern that losing around about, I think it's about 5% a year, was simply unsustainable. And the species seemed to be heading down the same pathway as the Baiji. It was during this time, of course, that the porpoises were being established in the Tien E Zhou Reserve and continuing to be monitored. I should also mention that it was, I think in 2017, been another survey, and initial results indicate that the decline in number may have actually stabilized. There's hope that it might have stopped, It'll be interesting to read those papers when they actually come out. If they may have done already, but I haven't seen any just yet. But that's all work to come and information to follow. It's a picture of the Tien E Zhou Oxbow. Just about wherever you go around the Oxbow, you can look out across and see finless porpoises popping up. There's one in the foreground, there's one mid-ground, and there's a couple further out on this photograph. It's so extraordinarily rare to see finless porpoises in an expanse of water like that. Because they don't have a fin, they have a very low profile in the water anyway. And so they're difficult to see even in a light swell. But to see small numbers of animals together spread out for a large area is really heartening, I have to say. The animals were first, there was, I think, 5 animals first introduced into this Oxbow in 1990, before it was formally established a reserve in 1992. The first checkup, if you like, or capture and examination of the animals started about 10 years later in 2002. And since then, they've been catching the animals every 5 years, doing a health examination, taking samples for genetic analysis to understand the makeup of the genetic makeup of the population. And what's also interesting, apart from clearly some success from this program of the animals, the process of learning how to catch these animals, transport them, and understanding the physiological response of these animals to those processes is really important for other species to mitigate the fatalities from capture myopathy. We know that happens with small cetaceans, other species. It can happen with this species too, it has done. But they've been able to refine their techniques in such a way to mitigate that from occurring. And that's important information that we want to look at for other species elsewhere. This information is from Professor Wang. It's in one of his presentations through ICPC that Dave mentioned. It's showing the numbers of finless porpoises in the Tien E Zhou Oxbow from 1996 to 2015, at which time there was up around 60 animals. I believe now the number is closer to 80. And it's considered to be that number is considered to be the maximum carrying capacity for that Oxbow, bearing in mind that the animals are feeding on fish which actually reproduce and are present in the lake. There's not a continuous flow of water between the river and the Oxbow. There was some measures put in place to prevent flooding. Since when they do the captures every 5 years, they do also put in pit tags into the animals and take the genetic sample, as I mentioned, to determine the parentage. The porpoises, now that they have more than Oxbow as well, porpoises are able to be transferred and are being transferred between the reserves. And there are trials have been undertaken to transfer porpoises between the reserves and also the research center and vice versa. And future trials obviously are geared to looking at transferring porpoises that are bred in these reserves back into the lakes and or the main stem of the river when the habitat in those when the natural habitat has improved. One of the other features in this Oxbow are these holding pens and intensive observation facilities that were begun in 2004, and over time they've also been improved and upgraded. with support from the government and also support from others. But this was a recommendation that was put forward at the workshop in 2004 after the first baiji that was caught and moved into the Oxbow Reserve died. And it was a recommendation to establish a holding facility to enable the folks to be able to monitor the baiji and intervene if need be with its health before actually releasing baiji into the main stem of the river. And as we know, that never happened again because there weren't any baijis around in 2006 in the survey. But it's a very important facility now for the finless porpoises because they're able to do the same thing, bring animals into here, whether they're coming and going from the reserve, bring them to here for intensive observation before they're moved on. And it's also a space in the Oxbow where porpoises are being born. The red porpoise is born in this facility as well before releasing them into the Oxbow. All of these things are really important steps in the overall conservation plan for the porpoises. I just want to mention this is the, Dave, if you can pronounce that, you get the prize. The second XC2 reserve, we'll call it, one that straddles the two counties. This was established in 2015. There were 12 animals initially located into that reserve. They've identified that 2 calves have been born since 2016, and their estimates that population are over 20. There's some discussion that this particular reserve has a higher carrying capacity than the Tien E Zhou reserve, which, if they're right, remains to be seen, but it'd be really nice if it was. You can also see from the photographs, or the things I notice, the improved stretchers and handling methods for moving animals from A to B. Lessons learned. Also, the net there, using a net to get under the animals to lift them out of the water or actually physically handling them, also offers a more safer approach to catching these animals in water that is impossible to see them underwater. So again, it's great to see these, not just the lessons learned, but also the support to establish more Oxbow reserves like this from the national government, but also from the provincial governments in this region. There's an enormous amount of pride that we've encountered, and you can feel it palpable with everybody living around these reserves. Pride in getting them established and seeing these animals grow in number. So what is interesting, I think, and it really also highlights, it should be, it's a significant thing that needs to be highlighted. The number of workshops over time have looked at saving the baiji initially and then working on the finless porpoise program have been quite extensive, and I just want to go through a few of them. This is not all, but just to give you some idea of the trajectory of workshops, symposia, all culminating in the achievements that we're able to witness today. Firstly, the workshop in 1986 on the biology and conservation of platanistoid dolphins, obviously referring to the baiji initially and other river dolphins. It was at that meeting that it was recommended to begin setting up these semi-natural reserves, and also to begin investigations into the role captive breeding might play in reversing the decline of the baiji. This is where it really began. And then in 1993, another international workshop where it was considered that the baiji could be going extinct and could be extinct within a few decades, what was also reported, and these are details published, that the species, it was considered that the species would not survive without some form of intervention. Later in 1997, another workshop to develop a conservation action plan for the Baiji, but also starting to look at the finless porpoise situation as well. In 2001, a workshop looking at a conservation action plan for cetaceans in China, and that plan was focusing on in-situ strategies, what needed to be done in the environment, artificial breeding at the research center, and studies that were needed to really understand the reproductive physiology of the porpoises. And if possible at that time, they were thinking, of course, the Baiji as well. And also the importance of establishing population in the reserves. By 2004, there was another workshop on the conservation of Baiji and Yangtze Finless porpoises. Again, discussing the role of ex-situ approaches for improving the conservation status of the Baiji and the finless porpoise. And it was at that workshop that the recommendation about establishing this intensive care facilities in the Oxbow Reserve was a recommendation. They were also considering, or further considering, the best practices for capture, transport, care, all of those elements of managing small cetaceans in captive environments. Fast forward a bit to 2014, the seminar on successful captive breeding of finless porpoises and leveraging more of the lessons learned from Japan and applying that to the research center. In 2017 came the national government's action plan for saving the Yangtze Finless porpoise. And it was this plan that really highlighted, I think, for the Nuremberg workshop that you spoke to earlier, Dave, and for the team now, that there is this potential example, which is a potential option for saving the species from extinction, that there may be lessons to be learned from it, which we can apply to other species elsewhere in the world, and particularly other riverine species. From that, of course, we then had the Symposium in 2019 doing just that, to look at the action plan in context of the IUCN One Plan approach that Phil has spoken to so eloquently last time, and also looking to generate ideas from that review that could be applied to small cetaceans moving forward elsewhere. So that's still a work in progress. A small group of us will be advancing that with more earnest this year, and looking at one of the recommendations is to have a population viability analysis for the ex-situ population of finless porpoises, and how that population be integrated into the in-situ population, the wild population. So that's going to be quite an exciting step as well. But it's interesting, 30 something years of making and effort has gone into where we are today in trying to save the species from extinction. But at every one of these workshops, when you look at the documentation that's published, it's clear the reserves are not the end game. That's not why developing a reserve for the sake of a reserve is not what it's all about. The natural habitat of the river and the lakes has to be restored, and the current act plan that was released in 2017 speaks to that in more detail. What it's also pointing out is that if there isn't an intentional, real effort to amend the Yangtze River, then finless porpoises will continue to be lost, and the species may be lost from the wild altogether. So the goal of the conservation effort has always been, and I think will continue to be, that a wild population of finless porpoises can be maintained in a healthy habitat in the Yangtze River or the Byong Lake or Dongting Lakes. And that's, and any ex situ conservation work that is done can only be regarded as successful if that's the outcome, that it's able to support and contribute to a healthy population of wild porpoises again. Fortunately, there is some movement in that regard. There are habitat restoration efforts underway. There was a commercial fishing ban across more than 300 reserves of the river that has been implemented, and now I want to say is being monitored. That's a follow-up question to the folks over there. But the government's fishing ban, for a 10-year fishing ban, is a significant change, which hopefully will yield some results. Further study, though, is going to be needed on the water use and also the impacts of sand mining and reducing sand mining, because what's happening there is it's essentially killing habitat for fish to reproduce, for porpoises to reproduce. And so there's still, as I say, there's still a lot of work to be done, a lot of hurdles to overcome. But there's a plan in place which seems to have some teeth, which the government is applying to the wild reserve, and you know, there's hope. This photograph, the background, by the way, it looks like a desert. That is actually the bottom of the lake. This photograph was taken the same time as those others earlier in the discussion, and you're looking at the bottom of Poyang Lake. As I said, I think it's a hopeful story, and there aren't that many hopeful stories around small cetaceans in the world today. It's a story that I think emphasizes the point that successful conservation action plans for small cetaceans take decades to be effective and to actually have an impact. Unfortunately, there weren't decades available and large numbers of animals available during the Baiji's time. The vaquita example is another, where years of work and negotiation with government and scientific study in the field that highlighted the precipitous decline of vaquita and the reasons why. But it was just too little too late to really put an effective plan into place. You know, the vaquita effort was one that was seriously lacking in a lot of the actions that are very clear and present in the Finless Porpoise Plan. And for that reason, I think the Finless Porpoise Plan is a hopeful one for the world. Coincidentally, and Phil pointed to this as well, the Pierre David's deer, which did go extinct in the wild, only found in China in the Yangtze River Basin area, went extinct during the 20th century. There just happened to be a small population of them at the Woburn Abbey Wildlife Park in the UK. And those offspring from that population were brought back China in the mid to late 80s. And there is a Pierre David's deer reserve adjacent to the Oxbow Reserve, the Tien E Zhou Oxbow Reserve, and that's the reserve in the background. So there's hope, I think, for the finless porpoises, and has been able to save the species of there, and let's just hope that they can do the same for the finless porpoises. And that's all I have for you, Dave.
Thank you, Grant. That is fantastic. Thank you for sharing all of that. I think, can you bring up that last slide really quick?
Which last slide?
Oh, the one before the thank you, the one of the Piers David deer. One of the things that I just wanted to kind of share with everybody, and from the experience that that I had with Grant at in China, is the enormous amount of effort being put in by the Chinese government to restore habitat and to you know, to create these Oxbow reserves, to take 10 years off of fishing for the entire length of the Yangtze River, or at least significant portions of it, to you know, traveling through China and then ending up in these natural reserve spaces. You can see kind of the impacts that it has on wildlife beyond the Yangtze Finless porpoise. And I think it's a good point to show that as we protect apex predators, the knock-on effects of protecting those animals is all of the other species that are benefiting alongside of them, including these deer. In the background of this picture, we see, you know, what looks like a natural forest, but most likely planted. And
someone's frozen, Dave. I don't know whether it's me or you.
uh-oh. Oh, there you're back.
Yep.
Okay, so we had a couple questions in here. There were questions about the Three Gorges Dam and the impact that the Three Gorges may be having on Yangtze Finless porpoise. Do you want to mention anything about that?
Yeah, there's not a lot of, there's no direct link to the Three Gorges Dam has caused X number of porpoises to go extinct. I mean, what you can say is the Three Gorges Dam has basically reduced the habitat and the historical range of finless porpoises. So it's reduced all of biodiversity and access to the habitat. No question about that. And I think what's going to be interesting, and there are some studies on this, is the impact of the dam on biodiversity at large during through the middle reaches and the lower reaches of Yangtze. For example, the Yangtze sturgeon, the largest sturgeon in the world, sturgeon fish that can grow up to 3 to 5 meters. During my tenure in Hong Kong, we worked with the fisheries looking at the sturgeon as well, and they were reporting that the sturgeon were no longer returning to their breeding traditional breeding grounds, and they were particularly concerned about that, and that was partly due to not just the dam, but obviously the water flow, the reduced water. The low water level seems to be much lower than it used to be. Maybe that's the dam. But also the intensive industrialization of that river, from all of that natural habitat to becoming a new city or a new town or a shipping channel for sand that's being mined upstream. You know, it's the combination of all of those things which is really continuing to contributing to the overall loss of biodiversity from that region, and I think it's that in its entirety that the national government is looking at, trying to reverse somehow.
So you mentioned sand mining a bunch, and I think it's you know, something we talked about certainly a lot in China. Can you mention, you know, what's sand being mined for? What is, you know, it's a building material, right, for all of the cities and whatnot that are going up?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, what's in your concrete?
Yeah, right.
Right. I mean, the population of folks living in that region of the world is something more of 400, maybe 500 million, more than the population of the United States in that part of the country. And it's been growing and expanding and increasing in wealth and standard of living, construction of roads, construction of buildings. It's just massive. And all of that material has to come from somewhere. And a lot of, the sand is coming out of the Yangtze and out of the bottom of those lakes.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty incredible. And I think putting into context, imagine the Mississippi River and taking the entire population of the United States and shoving everybody right alongside the Mississippi. We could imagine how that might impact biodiversity and whatnot on that resource. So we put that into a little bit of perspective. There was another question. We talked about this a little bit before we hit record about the reduction of water potentially from climate change and the impacts it may have on the river. You have a little insight to share about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, the dam is designed to retain, obviously, water for the people of China. And the water above the dam, much of it, I mean, the Yangtze River is fed from the Tibetan Plateau, right? And that's all snow melt and glacial melt. As climate change continues to impact glaciers and impact those regions of the world, you can imagine what may eventually happen, where you have this, reduced snow melt and glaciers in those regions. That's reduced water coming into Yangtze. The dam is going to be retaining as much as possible and regulating what it releases downstream for whatever activities need water. We see that already in other parts of the world, in the Himalayas, for Nepal and India, the number of dams and viaducts and redirecting water for irrigation and farming to grow food to feed people. It's a similar kind of situation, and you can see it occurring in China as well. I think the problems with global climate change are just going to exacerbate that. The low rainfall season, I mean, there's a lot of rainfall in that area, obviously, as well. The reduction in water level in the river and those lakes during that season is significant. 7 to 8 meters of reduced water level, and so that restricts the animal into much smaller areas of lake and river, and subjects them to more intensive contact, if you like, or proximity to shipping and all those human activities. That impacts the reproductive ability of the animals, and for young that are born to actually survive during that time. So all of those impacts that are cumulative in many ways, I mean, obviously have reached a tipping point and could continue to do so.
I think it's incredible to consider, that idea that the habitats that these animals exist in. Certainly, we talked about the semi-natural reserves and then the interaction that people have with preserving the species. But certainly the Yangtze River in itself is a managed space as well, from sand mining to water flow to irrigation to everything, everything in between. So the incredible resources that have been put into and the efforts to preserve biodiversity for the species, I think is a really great example, as you mentioned, for a model for other species, into the future.
I think it is a good model. Whether it can be applied to marine species or not remains to be seen. Obviously, geography and everything else is different. I think one of the key takeaways for me anyway is these kinds of conservation action plans for small cetaceans are generational. We're looking at this plan has been in the making and work progress for over 30 years, and it's not complete as a solid ex situ population that is truly an self-sustaining insurance population until river is improved and all of that, which could take another 30, 40, 50 years, who knows. That's the key thing, I think, and so I think we've got to really think about other species and places and be a little more bold in when we actually start these projects. And in addition to that, you need people like Wang Ding and all their colleagues at the Institute to have the tenacity to push forward, to really advance these projects and work with government, get government support, get international support, get the money to do it, get the social engagement, community engagement. It didn't come automatically for them. Communities living around the Oxbows, from what I recall from conversations with them, those communities were not rallying to save the baiji or rallying to save the finless porpoise all those years ago. Today they are. And again, that's a generational change and project. So to me, that's the biggest thing. We've got to be working on as many programs as we can now, because it's going to take decades before we can get to scale necessary to truly say you can save these species, or some of them, through ex situ integrated conservation.
Well, thank you so much, Grant, for talking with us tonight. I'm going to leave us with a comment here from Linda D. Ambrosio, who says, "Thank you for your incredible dedication throughout your life, Grant, and she'll see you in Amara in 3 years."
Oh, okay.
Thanks, Grant, for everything. I really appreciate you taking some time. I want to invite everybody back on February 17th. We have another Beneath the Surface talk with Mark Jackson, who's going to be talking to us about climate change and weather and how that impacts our local species of marine mammals. So another edition here. Thanks everybody for joining us, and we will see you on the 17th, hopefully. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Dave. Bye.
Bye-bye.